This is a milestone update for the game Debugging, which is currently in an early prototype phase. I'm attempting to develop this game first as horizontally as possible to get a little bit of every possible feature done first, and then digging down to the aesthetic qualities and whatnot. Um, that means that development has been challenging, and in such a way that these things often go, that things are both further behind and further along than I would have expected, and so I want to go through that a little bit. I've decided to use Unreal Engine 4, specifically Unreal Engine version 4.26 for this project. My reason being that I'm very comfortable with Unreal Engine, and I knew I'd need a combination of 2D and 3D aspects. Unreal would be able to provide that for me in a way that I'm very accustomed to. The ups and downs of it I can manage. I did not go with Unreal 5 because there are some aspects of that require more performant hardware, which means it's harder to develop and harder for people to play. Even though there are certain optimizations for things like real-time rendering of lighting and things like that, mesh optimization, that's something that sort of has a higher benefit towards large-scale games than small games. Do not benefit, or potentially, in a net sense, detriment from the engine requirements. So here I am with Unreal 4. It's worth mentioning that this is still proving to be a challenge for me to develop because Debugging is a game about, debugging a game. And so to control what is something normally that feels erratic, it's requiring me to do a lot of from the ground up construction of the game. I'm not, programming my own, collision detections or anything like that. I'm still using a lot of Unreal's helper functions, and I'm using Unreal's visual scripting for all this. That being said, there is a lot in terms of kind of prepackaged functionality that Unreal normally provides and I'm not using. To give an example here, I'm going to go ahead and hit play so you can see the game. And moving around, for example, looks a little stiff. You'll notice, I kind of had a little odd interaction there, where because I'm recording right now and because, I'm also playing the game at the same time, I can drop the performance to such a point where the player can kind of clip through narrow collision. Ideally, that's something that will be addressed when I have the proper meshes for things, and I can continue to tweak it. But for right now, it kind of proposes this big issue. So working with Unreal Engine here, although it's something I am comfortable with, I'm dealing with new challenges that I don't normally deal with. Typically, if you're using prepackaged stuff like the character that Unreal normally gives you, then you'd not be seeing this problem very often. But I'm not using Unreal's character type class in order to do this stuff. If the character can move, can drop with gravity, can collide with objects, that's all things that I'm sort of trying to manipulate manually. And so let me go ahead and open up the base class here. I'm trying to embed these characteristics into one single actor type that any other actor type can kind of mimic. So although I have separate objects for all these different things, collectibles and interactive mechanisms, they really don't differ that much from the parent class object base. For example, here's object B's, which are supposed to fly straight at the player character after they've been spawned and try to destroy the player and themselves. That being said, this is all that's uniquely in here. Everything else is just a modification of what every one of these actors is going to know and have. The idea that if you give something a velocity, it can fly forward on its own like a bee would. And that a bee is just, anything else with just a velocity applied. This means that there's a lot of these little technical issues I have to solve, like, for example, making sure that the collision is rigorous enough to prevent the player from clipping through things without making it too stiff. And it's meant a lot of sacrifices when I'm not, mathematically proficient for things like this. So I would find that the player could, say, fall off of a ledge, then clip back into the side of the mesh to get a valid collision, but then get them trapped inside, and so that was not going to fly. Now, if you fall off a ledge, you just drop straight down. It removes your ability to move while in midair. It's a little less fun. It's a little more stiff, but it's a puzzle-type game, so it's okay. It's been a lot of design concessions so far, building this project. It's also the reason why it's not entirely to the learning state yet. This is going to be kind of an epistemological kind of game where you're learning what it's like to be a QA tester in the process of bumping around and testing properties of objects and filing reports on how things are functioning versus how they're expected to function. And so in some ways, we have the bones of that prepared. I can click on any object and see, here's this readout of properties. But the challenges that are being posed by development means that what you're seeing here is going to change very fast. And so therefore, I'm not entirely certain what I can test the player on until I can ensure that it's, technically viable. One thing, for instance, I want to get into is how, we assess trigger volumes and variables. Originally, the plan was that in order to make sure that the bugged behavior or the contradiction in the level couldn't be ambiguous between two objects, the plan was that if a trigger is bugged, it's bugged because it has the wrong function it's trying to run, whereas the code is just kind of what value the variable argument has for that function. It seemed discrete enough when I was designing for a while that, triggers do one thing, code does another. They're linked, but the problem would only be in one place. The issue is that to make sure that these objects can all behave from the same base level, they all have these same base variables. And so if one object, for example, were to have its trigger changed from activating collecting score to destroying the player instead, then that wouldn't actually show up as anything unless the damage variable was also changed. And so therefore, we'd come to this point where either functions would do everything themselves, variables would do everything themselves, or in the worst case, both, in which case it becomes an ambiguous situation that has two answers. And that kind of flies in the face of the practicality of the game as a learning tool. In real programming, it's almost always going to go two ways, right? When one thing collides with another thing, that's two ways, right? I collide with you, you collide with me. But for the purposes of streamlining this sort of critical activity of find the error, I'm trying to reduce that ambiguity such that we can elucidate just one problem and then make sure that across the game the player is getting a variety of problems rather than answering things always the same way. Maybe a player always looks at variables instead of looking at functions. So those kind of technical issues in development are affecting how I'm designing sort of the educational basis and the epistemological basis of the game. What you see here is going to be changed soon. Triggers will no longer have functions listed at all, and instead we're going to look at just the shape of blocking collision and triggering collision as the thing that could go wrong. Additionally, variables are going to have an on and an off as well as a variable value. That way, players can note that the state of a variable is on or off when it should be off or on, and then additionally the value might be wrong. This was another one of those ambiguous situations. Let's say that damage is 0. that means that damage is technically off. However, if an object doesn't have a function to do damage anyways, then which is it? And so in order to make sure that we don't have those overlaps, I'm going to have to sort of elucidate that if we're looking at an error of, say, size, if a variable is too high or too low, then it will strictly be for higher or lower, and null values need to be something else. That will be the state of the variable, much like the state of an art piece would be its asset that it's picked out. So this has been a lot of going back and forth, a lot of finding out, where's too much information being laid in, where am I going to find conflicts, back up to art for a moment, how am I going to fit 15 to 16 different options of art assets on screen in one form. It's probably going to require some scrolling, and that user interface is going to get cluttered pretty fast. So instead, I've decided just today I'm going to cut that down into groups, that art assets will be categorized by certain types of objects. Interactives like the player, collectibles, bees, things that move and touch, turnstiles, those are kind of one category. We have stationary stuff like cacti and this log bridge. Those will constitute one category for art. And so that way you're only ever looking at 5 to 6 options in a drop-down rather than, the entire list of what's in the game. Now, to get back around to, the engine and developing on it, I don't know that I would recommend Unreal to people, trying to do this kind of project from the start. Something that's a little less pre-rigged for special types of games like Unreal is, something like Godot or Unity or GameMaker maybe would be more proficient for this, in the sense that you're already kind of doing things from scratch. Unreal has a trajectory formed from the games it was meant to make. It was meant to make action games. It was meant to make shooters. And so that means that puzzle type elements, 2D elements, user interface, these things can be a little quirky and a little stiff to work with as a developer. I've gotten used to them. I wouldn't recommend it to someone else. I am going to continue forward with Unreal, for sure. If anything, it kind of keeps me honest as a developer that I have to really work with or against the engine and handle that as best as I can. But again, I would caution people against using Unreal when they don't need that performant style of toolkit features that Unreal comes with. But I do think that Unreal has lots of ins for learning. For students, for people looking to make games, its visual scripting systems, I feel are great for taking programming and making it less scary. Though I've also heard kind of the inverse, that people who are used to traditional line programming just hate looking at all this visual clutter. But I do think that Unreal has this kind of established grammar or maybe a dictionary that kind of helps to make these things approachable. The fact that we can talk about getting and setting variables, and that having a very particular kind of effect on how you program in the game, right? That something like a variable maybe makes more sense when you can know that it has a certain value and can be set to a certain value, and that's it. Whereas if you're line-by-line programming, there can be this feeling of, what don't I know that I'm missing out on? When Unreal kind of tamps down these options, I think it does maybe sort of reduce the uncertainty and the analysis paralysis that can come with that. Additionally, the way that Unreal handles and categorizes objects has definitely had an impact on the design of the game. For instance, I've certainly streamlined things, beyond Unreal, but the fact that it separates blocking and overlap collisions, that has definitely had an impact on what block and trigger ended up being in the game, rather than having just has collision and separating it into a state of blocking or triggering. I've separated them into two discrete things, which is not how Unreal does it. But I think it goes to show that Unreal's method of sort of categorizing and separating object function has been kind of healthy for me to understand game elements in very traditional forms, and for me to understand them in other engines as well. Let's see. Last notes that I want to make, that luckily Unreal has the versatility to keep things open-ended for other options. For instance, something I'm still weighing in on is whether or not I want to do an isometric view of the game, or if I want to keep a perspective view. Unreal's cameras can switch between those on the fly. For example, I've been showing perspective projections so far, but I can toggle to orthographic if I want. The camera's not going to be well positioned for this right now, but I can at least show that, hey, if I'm finding the visual clarity in perspective mode is not good enough, if I'm not liking the effect of things being able to kind of disappear into the distance, then I can give it this rigid rendering instead. Not to say that other engines don't do this, but I am at least thankful that Unreal does allow it, and therefore I'm anticipating that I can take these questions to playtesters, right? I'm hoping very soon to be able to ask people, hey, which do you prefer? Do you like looking at this orthographic mode, or do you like the perspective mode? I want to try to get these figured out early, so that we can go from there. One thing that's majorly missing right now is the ability to fill out forms. The report it function is currently not a function at all. That's definitely the most devastating, I think, part of these setbacks, is not having that ready yet. I'm hoping it will be quick to do. I think that's kind of the lesson from this project so far, is that the technical construction of a lot of these elements is not too time consuming, aside from some of the really nasty stuff early on like collision. But really what ends up taking a lot of time is the decisions around those things. For example, do I do a collision box on the character or a capsule? Do I want to keep ramps in my game and sacrifice the convenience of box interactions on ledges? Do I want to include jumping and gravity, or do I just want to keep the character on the ground in order to reduce the cases where a player gets stuck on top of an object and then gets trapped, unable to fall off of it properly, or things like that? Those kinds of things have kept me away from some of the more substantial features, like being able to report opening documentation on objects, properly filling out that documentation in art form or in engine. But the design decisions in between, I think, are important ones that are flavoring how this comes out. So I'm doing my best to stay patient with it, and to kind of remember that the critical parts of development here are not just the mechanical hammering through of making things work. That making things work is part and parcel with designing how they work. Thank you for listening to this check-in, and I'm looking forward to delivering more on this game as soon as I can.